Systems thinking. What we're going to cover in this video is the definition of a system, systems thinking, the what, when, why, where, and how, the hidden costs of analytical thinking, the myth and truth of knowledge, and how the next 6 weeks is going to be organized. A system is a group of parts that form a unified whole. So I represent systems this way. Systems can be broken down into their component parts. And systems are always contained in larger systems. Systems will tend to have properties that the parts do not. So in this image here, you see a cell that builds up tissue, that builds up an organ. In this case, it's a heart. That creates the cardiovascular system. That creates a human or any organism. And then the product, or the emergent property, as I term it, the emergent property of humans is consciousness. There are other emergent properties, but that's just one. So we know very little about consciousness, and without getting too woo-woo about this, we're pretty certain that none of the parts that make us human individually have consciousness. It's just an organism that has some ability to be conscious, right? So it's an emergent property of the system. All of the parts that build us up build up to this idea of consciousness. Relating that back to Bitcoin. We have Bitcoins. On the Bitcoin blockchain, those are also called UTXOs. Then we have transactions that are built with inputs and outputs. Those transactions are stacked together in what are called blocks. The blocks and the timing of blocks are regulated in the system of full nodes and miners. That system of regulating blocks and block timing will then create a blockchain, and the whole emergent property of that is decentralization. So the primary purpose of creating a blockchain at all is so that we can have a payment processor and currency that is in fact decentralized. At times I'm going to call the blockchain decentralized, and at times I'm going to call it an approximation of decentralization. But I just want you to be aware that there are many emergent properties of the blockchain, but the primary one, the primary reason that we have blockchains at all is for decentralization. Decentralization is a very hard property to obtain. It's something a lot of blockchains don't have at all, so it's not a necessary property. But without saying too much about this, decentralization is something that a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space, the early cryptocurrency space, I would say so early that the word cryptocurrency didn't exist, right? Those early cypherpunks, who we'll talk more about later, what they were trying to achieve was a system that could be decentralized. Most blockchains are not decentralized, and Bitcoin is sort of barely decentralized. But that's already saying a little bit more than I want to for this video. The point that I want to get here is just to relate these two images. So everyone understands the body. We understand that consciousness is an emergent property of the body. And I want you to be able to relate that to the blockchain and understand how decentralization is an emergent property of the blockchain. To explain the idea of systems thinking further, we can take a car as an example. A car is a simple mechanical system that everyone is also familiar with, much like the body example that I used in the previous one. If you were to ask how an engine works, a mechanic can explain how the system of combining oil with oxygen works to make the car move forward. Then he could also show you how the engine works and how that combustion process works by taking the engine apart and showing you the interaction between the parts. So when we ask questions about the world, right, when we're looking out into the world and trying to perceive as much of reality as we can, we parse that information with questions. So we'll ask questions like who, what, when, right? Those questions are all data-based questions. The idea is to take what, out of all the information that's out there, what parts of that information are actually useful? What parts of that information is actually useful data? Okay, but when we ask how questions, how does the engine work? How is this car being moved forward with combustion? That question is designed to produce instruction and skill. So when you say, how do I get from point A to point B? How does Bitcoin work? How does the blockchain work? How do I use Bitcoin? All of those questions are going to direct you towards skill. So you remember in the first video how I was asking the wrong questions about Bitcoin, and I didn't even realize it because I kept asking how questions, which is what pushed me to become a developer. And I didn't even necessarily want to be a developer. I just wanted to understand Bitcoin. So I'm going to continue with this idea of the car analogy, and then you'll understand this more. So if I were to ask you, instead of how the engine works, but why the engine is up front, we understand that taking the engine apart will no longer help you, right? Because why questions explain desire. They explain big picture aspects of what it is going on in the system. Why does Bitcoin need to exist? Why does Bitcoin work? Those were the questions that I should have been asking, and that would have helped me understand so much more, so much faster. Analytical thinking focuses us on the parts of the system and their functions. Analytical thinking occurs in 3 steps. So you'll be familiar with this image because I showed this earlier. Analytical thinking, step 1. You take the system that you're trying to understand, which is here on the left, and then you break that system up into parts. So you have part 1, part 2, part 3. Then what you do is you get an understanding of what the parts do taken separately. Okay, and then once you have an understanding of each part, step 3 is to integrate your understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. Now, this is how almost all tech books are organized. This is how most of society is organized, how most companies are organized. You break the system up into parts. You have a marketing department, you have a business department, you have a sales department, right? And then all of those parts are supposed to come together to make a system. I'll give you an example just so you can see how that works for the blockchain. If you've ever done any cursory research into what the blockchain is, which I assume most of you have before coming here, you've tried to learn about the blockchain elsewhere, right? And what everyone is going to do is they break the blockchain up into parts. So you have cryptography, coins, nodes, miners, smart contracts. And then what they do is they take each one of those things taken separately, probably in the form of like a blog post or video, and then they'll try and explain that concept in full. Then the assumption is that, okay, now that you understand those parts, okay, now you understand the blockchain. That doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work. And that's what I mean by when I say the hidden costs of analytical thinking. You have to think about how there are different types of people in the world and they do think differently. There are people who are left-brained and right-brained. Yes, I understand that dichotomy has not really held up to be true anymore, but just go with me because everyone knows what that means, right? You have analytical thinkers and then you have creative thinkers. Now, most people who go into the sciences go into it because we filter for analytical minds to push them into the sciences. It's just the way the system works, the way the university system works. I mean, even when you're much younger than university level, everyone is taught that if you're analytically minded, well, then you're scientifically minded. If you're a little bit less ordered and you're a little more chaotic, well then, you're also creative. You should go into the arts. But this is so broken. In my mind, this is so broken. And also from the previous video, you'll remember the idea that in the past, before the concept of artists and science and scientists more specifically was even fully evolved, people were both, because people were allowed to be both. Most STEM fields are structured by this analytical way of thinking. So when I was studying C++, I only took like a year-long class. I think it was 2 semester-long classes on it. But I did consider taking a computer science major for it. And I looked at the way that we were taught computer science. I was looking at some Stanford curriculum and some MIT curriculum, and everyone broke down computer science into these categories: discrete mathematics, compiler construction, and data structures. This story about how you learn computer science is so ingrained that the history of computer science is not even taught, right? You don't teach computer science as an evolving whole. You never teach computers. You're never allowed to teach computer science as a whole. You're never allowed to teach any subject as a whole. You can only break it down into parts. Now, I believe it was Peter Thiel. I was watching a video of his where he said, you're not allowed to criticize systems as a whole, and the result is people just stay very, very small-minded. I mean, think about how long people spend writing a PhD dissertation just to expand human knowledge in this little tiny area, 2 centimeters. We're taking arguably some of the smartest people in our culture, in our society, and telling them the most productive way to spend their time is to break systems apart into parts, understand the parts, and never talk about the whole, right? And that's the hidden cost of analytical thinking that is so pervasive that people don't see it. All right, so a little tangent there. Let me get back to this idea of systems thinking, okay? So I compared it, I wanted to talk about computer science, and then now I'm talking about cryptography. Cryptography is often broken down into trust models, cryptographic algorithms, factoring integers. This is very, very basic. Obviously, it gets much more complicated than that. All right, but because analytical thinking focuses you on the parts, it can at times be hard to see the big picture. Yes, there are some people who would like to discuss the big picture, but what I'm seeing is that what's even more common is that when people are trained in this analytical thinking for so long, they can't even see the big picture at all. Now, when I talk about Bitcoin, one of the things that became painfully obvious to me about the flaws of analytical thinking is that every part can be broken down into smaller parts. The Greeks realized this too, right? When they were breaking things down into parts, they realized that the elements, water, fire, air, oh, well, those are broken down into even smaller things. Then, of course, we discover the atom, and then we realize, oh my God, that can be broken down into even smaller things as well. There's this sort of resolution to reality where it seems to be endless. It seems to just always, you seem to always be able to go deeper and bigger. The system is just expanding in every direction, and you can never find what is the actual fundamental part. So what that means when you're looking at a system like Bitcoin, yes, the fundamental part is things like bits, but ultimately you have a long way down before you get to bits. So if I'm talking about something like mining, and then I'm talking about a smaller component part, which is say hashes, that can just go on and on and on and on. I can just so easily spiral down because you don't have an appropriate place to rest that break in analytical thinking. You're like, okay, this is as far down as I'm going to go. So it can be hard for analytical people or anyone who's thinking analytically to find the proper level of resolution. Now, to contrast analytical thinking, there's another term called synthetic thinking. Synthetic thinking is big picture thinking. It focuses on the purpose and the function of the whole system. Synthetic thinking also occurs in 3 steps. So step 1, you take the system you're trying to understand, and then you look at its larger containing system. Then step 2 is to understand the role of that containing system. Step 3 is to understand the interactions between each of the systems in the containing system. So an example might be philosophy, right? Philosophy has many different branches. It has metaphysics, epistemology, politics, right? So if you wanted to understand any one of those branches, first you'd have to look at philosophy as a whole, then you'd have to look at the different branches of philosophy that you're neighbors within that containing whole. In Bitcoin, there are a few different ways to look at its containing system. So because Bitcoin is the system we're trying to understand, what are its containing systems? And do start a discussion group if you can think of more. One containing system is cryptocurrency and money. Those could actually probably be separated into 2 totally different systems. Then another containing system is governance, regulation. Another containing system is economics and markets. And really, a lot of these systems overlap in more places than they don't. So you can see how synthetic thinking really contrasts with analytical thinking. What I observed when I was setting out to learn more about Bitcoin is that most explanations about Bitcoin will only ever cover one of these categories. They will either be analytical, or they'll be about cryptocurrency, or they'll be about governance and regulation, or they'll be about economics and markets. So analytical thinking is intended for developers. Talking about the big picture of cryptocurrency and money is intended for investors. Talking about the big picture of regulation is intended for probably lawyers. Talking about the big picture of economics is intended for nerds or the politically inclined. So what I want to do, I don't want to contradict myself, because I know that in the previous video I said it's very important for you to define your objective and what it is you're trying to learn about cryptocurrency, what it is you're trying to learn about Bitcoin. But I should be clear that it will help you to understand some part of each one of these ways of thinking. Because if you understand a little bit of what developers are talking about, that's going to make for a much more sophisticated investment decision, right? So these things, although each one of these types of explanations do cater to a particular objective, there is a base level of knowledge that's helpful for every objective that you could imagine. If you are someone who's interested in cryptocurrency, understanding how other people think in this big industry, in this growing industry, is going to help you.